You are standing at the corner of King Street and Bridge Street, in the heart of Westminster, and the gas lamps have just been lit against a November fog that tastes faintly of coal smoke and the river. It is 1888. The clock tower at the Houses of Parliament is close enough that you can hear it counting the hour through the wet air, and the pavement outside a public house called the Mitre and Dove is doing brisk business, though not the business a passerby might expect on an ordinary Tuesday evening. There are soldiers here, not marching, not on duty in any sense the army would recognize, but standing in a loose companionable row along the wall of the pub, red coats buttoned to the throat, forage caps set at an angle that took some private practice in a barracks mirror. Their boots are polished to a shine that catches the lamplight and throws it back. Their mustaches are waxed. One of them, a broad man with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and a small fan of campaign medals pinned above his heart, is laughing at something. The laugh is warm, unhurried, and it carries down the street. This scene is real enough that a photographer named John Thompson stood almost exactly where you are standing and took a picture of it 11 years earlier, in 1877, for a series he made with the journalist Adolph Smith called Street Life in London. The picture shows the sergeants arranged along the same stretch of wall outside the same public house, waiting, patient, dressed for effect. The corner outside the Mitre and Dove had a reputation that outlasted that one photograph by more than a decade. Men across the city knew that if you wanted to hear about army life, about the Queen's service, about a way out of whatever had gone wrong in your own particular life, this was the corner where you came to ask. Look closer, though, at the man leaning against the doorframe with a pewter tankard in each hand. He has already picked someone out. A younger man in a threadbare coat, hatless, has just turned the corner from the direction of the river with his shoulders drawn up against the cold. And the sergeant has read him, in about 4 seconds flat, the walk that says no work today, no work yesterday either, the coat that belonged to someone else. The sergeant is already crossing the pavement toward him, tankard extended, his face arranged into an expression of pure, uncomplicated welcome. Come in out of the cold. Friend, let me buy you a drink. Have you eaten today? It looks like kindness. In the lamplight, with a fire visible through the pub's windows and the smell of something roasting drifting out into the fog, it looks exactly like kindness, and that is the entire point of it. Every gesture the sergeant makes tonight has been made 1,000 times before, worn smooth by repetition, until it reads a spontaneous warmth to the man on the receiving end of it. The uniform helps, the medals help. The laugh helps most of all, because a laugh like that suggests a life without complications, a life a hungry, unemployed young man might reasonably want for himself. Beneath all of that, beneath the red wool and the polished boots and the easy laugh, the corner outside the Mitre and Dove was one of the most efficient machines Victorian London had built for converting a man's desperation into his obedience, and London had built quite a few. The story of what happens next is far more calculated, far more legally binding, and far more permanent than anything a passerby glancing at that friendly little scene would ever guess. This is 1888, in a London where the docks hire men by the half day and drop them without notice, where a run of 3 or 4 bad weeks can end a family's tenancy inside a fortnight, and where the British Empire needs a steady, renewable supply of young men's bodies to hold India, to garrison the west coast of Africa, to keep fighting a war on the Sudanese frontier that most Londoners could not have located on a map. The Empire has built an entire recruiting culture around persuading those bodies to volunteer for the privilege of being sent to those places, and it has built that culture out of beer, flattery, and a coin worth exactly 1 shilling. Nobody needed to force these men into the army at gunpoint. Poverty did most of the work in advance. The recruiting sergeant simply stood at the door. Poverty was already pushing men through, holding out a drink and a story. This video is what actually happened once a man like the one you just watched crossed that particular threshold. Not the version printed on the recruiting posters, with their tigers and pyramids and gleaming bayonets and grateful colonial subjects. The real one. The coin pressed into a palm, or dropped quietly into a coat pocket, or, as more than one Victorian newspaper insisted, slipped straight into the bottom of a tankard of ale, so that the mere act of drinking became the act of enlisting. The oath, sworn the next morning with a headache the man could not remember earning. The 24 hours the law technically gave him to change his mind, and the sum of money entirely out of reach for someone in his position. That changing his mind would have cost him. The army surgeon who was paid a shilling for every recruit he pronounced fit, whether or not the man standing half-dressed in front of him actually was. The regiments, the troopships, and the diseases waiting on the far side of the world that would kill far more British soldiers than any enemy's rifle ever did. And the households left behind in London, the mothers and wives and younger brothers, working out how to eat without the wages that had just walked out the door wearing red wool. Before we go further, if this kind of unpolished history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real texture of the past than its recruiting poster, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel keep doing this particular kind of work, the kind that takes longer than it looks. And if one detail tonight catches you and will not let go, the shilling in the tankard, the 24 hours, the doctor paid by the head, leave a comment about it. I do read every one. Let us begin then, not with the shilling itself, but with the man whose hand was about to close around it. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Walter Coombs, and on that particular November evening in 1888, he is 19 years old, 5 feet and 6 inches tall, built along the narrow, wiry lines of a young man who has done physical work since he was 12 and has not eaten quite enough of it in recent months. He lives in 2 rented rooms in Lambeth on the south side of the river, with his mother, his younger sister Ada, who is 11, and his younger brother Sam, who is 8. His father, a lighterman on the Thames, drowned 3 winters ago in an accident nobody in the family likes to describe in detail, and since then, Walter has been the household's main wage, first as an apprentice to a bootmaker in the cut, and more recently, since the workshop cut its apprentices loose in the autumn slump, as whatever casual labourer the docks and the building sites will take on for a day at a time. His body, if you saw it without the coat, tells the story plainly enough. He is undernourished in the specific, unglamorous way of a poor Londoner in a bad year. Not gaunt, not visibly starving, just perpetually a little short of what his frame and his labour actually require, so that his collarbones show. His hands are a working man's hands, regardless, calloused across the palm from awls and hammers, and now from carrying loads he was never trained to carry. His boots, the one pair he owns, have been resoled twice and are close to needing a 3rd repair he cannot currently afford, which is itself a small private humiliation for a young man who spent 2 years learning to make good boots for other people. He is, in the eyes of anyone glancing at him on the street, entirely unremarkable, one more thin young man in a worn coat, and that is precisely the point. London in 1888 is full of Walter Coombs, and the recruiting sergeants outside the Mitre and Dove know it better than anyone. What nobody sees walking past him is the specific arithmetic he has been running in his head for 6 weeks. He owes his landlord back rent, some that grows a little more unmanageable every Friday. His mother takes in washing, which brings in pennies rather than shillings. Ada minds a neighbour's smaller children for a few coppers a week. Sam is too young to bring in anything at all, except an extra mouth that needs feeding. Walter has not told his mother how close they actually are to the workhouse, because he has decided, in the private and somewhat theatrical way of a 19-year-old carrying a burden he has not fully sized up, that it will not come to that. He has one small, entirely private vanity, which is his singing voice, a surprisingly good one that he uses on Sunday evenings in a local public house for whatever coins the other patrons feel like tossing his way, and which his mother has told him could take him somewhere better than the docks if only he had the connections and the luck to go with it. He has neither tonight, which is a large part of why he is walking north across Westminster Bridge in the cold, with nowhere particular to be, and the stomach that has had nothing in it since noon. He is not looking for the army. That needs to be said plainly, because it is the detail every recruiting poster and every regimental memoir conveniently leaves out. Walter Coombs has not spent the autumn dreaming of India or glory or a red coat of his own. He is looking, on this particular evening, for warmth he does not have to pay for, and possibly a free meal, both of which a certain kind of London public house has long been known to offer to a young man willing to sit near the right corner. He has heard, the way most poor young men in London had heard, that the corner by the Mitre and Dove is one of those places. He has heard it is where the soldiers stand. He has not thought very hard about what that means. He is about to find out. If you imagine a Victorian recruiting sergeant, you probably picture something close to what Walter is about to meet. A genial, weathered veteran who has seen the world, who tells stories about elephants and pyramids and paydays, who seems to have wandered into your evening purely by chance and taken a liking to you. That image is not wrong so much as it is incomplete. It is the visible 10% of an operation built almost entirely out of the 90% nobody was meant to notice. The man who steps toward Walter that evening wears the collar badges of a cavalry regiment and the good-natured face of someone who has told the same 6 stories several hundred times and still manages to sound as though he is telling them for the first time. Call him what regiments across London call men like him. A recruiting sergeant, seconded from ordinary duty to a specific, unglamorous, and highly incentivized job, which was finding warm bodies and turning them into soldiers before the evening was out. He was not paid a salary for standing outside the Mitre and Dove. He was paid by results. Regimental and war office records from across the period show recruiting parties working on a bounty system, a fixed sum, sometimes as much as £1, 11 shillings and sixpence, paid out for every man successfully attested into the ranks. A sum that in a bad year could represent more than a week's wages for the sort of unemployed labourer he was chasing. The kinder his face, the more convincing his stories, the more coins landed in his own pocket by the end of the month. Kindness, in other words, was his trade, and he had gotten very good at it precisely because his income depended on it. The pub itself was not a random choice. The Mitre and Dove, on that particular corner of Westminster, had been a known recruiting ground for at least a decade, by 1888. Documented well enough that a magazine photographer had made a point of capturing it in 1877 as a piece of social reportage. Sergeants from half a dozen regiments worked that stretch of pavement in rotation, cavalry and infantry both, because the location did the initial filtering for them. Westminster sat close enough to the river, to the docks, to the casual labour markets of Lambeth and the Borough, that a hungry, unemployed young man, drifting north across the bridge in search of warmth, was likely to end up exactly there. The sergeants did not have to search London for their prey. London delivered it to them on a schedule as reliable as the tide. Their methods, once a likely young man wandered into range, followed a pattern refined over generations of recruiting practice, stretching back well before the Victorian era, back into the 18th century, when private agents called crimps had worked London's taverns on behalf of both the army, plying the unemployed and the indebted with drink and false promises until the crowds finally turned on them, most famously in 1794, when mobs tore apart known crimping houses across the city in a wave of riots that made the papers for weeks. By 1888, the crimp, the distinct semi-criminal middleman, had mostly disappeared, absorbed into the more respectable, uniformed figure of the regimental recruiting sergeant, but the underlying method survived almost untouched. Identify a man who is hungry, cold, and without immediate prospects. Offer him warmth and food before you offer him anything resembling a contract. Let the beer keep flowing. Tell stories calibrated to whatever seems to be missing from his life. Adventure if he looks bored, respect if he looks beaten down, a full stomach and a wage if he looks as Walter does, simply hungry. Never mention the word obligation until it no longer matters whether he has heard it or not. Walter's evening runs exactly to that pattern. The sergeant, who introduces himself with easy warmth as though they are old acquaintances rather than strangers who met 90 seconds earlier, steers him inside, orders a plate of hot food and a pint of porter before Walter has said more than a dozen words about himself, and begins talking, unhurried, about India, about pay that arrives regularly whether or not the docks are hiring that week, about a uniform that commands a kind of respect Walter has never once been shown on a London street. He does not ask Walter to enlist, not yet. He asks him about his mother, his trade, his hopes, listening with an attentiveness that feels, to a young man who has not been listened to in this particular way in longer than he can remember, almost unbearably kind. Then another. The fire is warm, the food is good, and for the first time in weeks, Walter is not doing the exhausting mental arithmetic of rent against wages, because for this one evening, someone else appears to be handling it for him. Historians who have studied Victorian recruitment, among them Edward Spires, whose work on the late Victorian army remains one of the most detailed accounts of who actually filled its ranks and why, describe this dynamic in blunt terms. The British Army of the 1882nd drew the overwhelming majority of its recruits from the poorest strata of urban society, from the unemployed, the underemployed, and men in visible economic distress, precisely because those were the men most susceptible to an evening like the one Walter is currently enjoying. Respectable, steadily employed working men mostly stayed away from recruiting sergeants entirely, both because they had less need of the offer and because the army carried a real social stigma among the more settled working class, a suspicion. The sergeants understood this as clearly as any modern recruiter understands a target demographic, and they built their entire evening's performance around men in exactly Walter's position. The logic was practical from the sergeant's point of view and from the war officers above him. An empire that needed a constant renewable supply of soldiers for garrisons in India, for coastal stations in West Africa, for a war on the Sudanese frontier that showed no sign of ending, could not rely on patriotic enthusiasm alone to fill its regiments, not when army pay was low, army discipline was harsh. And army postings could mean years overseas, in places with a well-earned reputation for killing Englishmen through disease long before any enemy got the chance. What the empire needed was a mechanism that made enlistment look, for one warm evening, like the obvious, generous, almost accidental solution to a young man's immediate problem. The recruiting sergeant, uniformed, funded, and paid by the head, was that mechanism, and the pub was his workshop. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that none of this required deception in the crude sense. The sergeant did not lie to Walter about the existence of India, or the pay scale, or the uniform. He simply told the truth, selectively, in the order most likely to produce a signature, and let the beer do the rest of the persuading. And critically, everybody standing along that pavement outside the Mitre and Dove that November evening, every sergeant, every hungry young man drifting past, understood roughly what was happening. It was not a secret. It was simply a transaction that most of London had quietly agreed to stop examining too closely, because looking away from it was easier than omitting how many of its own sons the arrangement was designed to catch. Now, the coin itself. Because everything that has happened to Walter so far, the food, the warmth, the stories, the attentive listening, has been prelude. The actual mechanism of the trap, the piece of Victorian law and custom that turned a friendly evening into an unbreakable legal bond, was smaller than a farthing bun and worth exactly 1 shilling, and it was about to be pressed into his hand. If you have ever heard the phrase taking the Queen's shilling, you probably picture it as a figure of speech, a quaint bit of old English, meaning roughly to accept a job, the way people still say it today about almost anything from journalism to politics. That is what the phrase became, eventually, once it had drifted far enough from the pub floor to lose its teeth. In 1888, it was not a figure of speech. It was a specific, physical, legally freighted act, and a man in Walter's position needed to understand exactly what his own fingers were about to do, because his fingers were about to do it whether he understood it or not. The custom itself was already old by the time Walter encountered it, older than the Queen on the coin, older than the regiment the sergeant belonged to. English armies had used an earnest payment, a shilling handed to a man as a binding token of his agreement to serve, since at least the 17th century, inherited from an older tradition in English contract law, where a small sum of money exchanged in front of witnesses. By the Victorian period, the formal legal weight of the coin itself had softened considerably. A man who took a shilling from a sergeant's hand was not, strictly speaking, a soldier the instant the coin touched his palm. What he had actually done was agree, in a manner witnesses could attest to present himself for formal attestation before a magistrate, an oath-taking that was the true legal moment of enlistment. But almost nobody explained that distinction to the men receiving the coin, least of all the sergeants whose bounty depended on those men believing the trap had already closed. This is where the story of the tankard comes in, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than simply repeated as folklore. Victorian newspapers and popular memory both preserved a vivid image of the trick. A sergeant slipping the shilling into the bottom of a man's drink while his attention was elsewhere, so that the moment his lips touched the ale, he had unknowingly and irreversibly accepted the coin. The image was compelling enough that pewter tankards with a small disc of glass set into the base became a genuine documented Georgian and Victorian product, sold specifically so a cautious drinker could hold his tankard up to the light and check for a coin before he drank a drop. Whether the trick was ever as widespread as the tankards suggest, or whether the glass bottom mostly answered a fear that had outgrown the reality behind it, historians disagree, and honest history has to admit that disagreement rather than paper over it. What is not in dispute is the far more mundane version of the same trick, recorded again and again in the period's own accounts. A sergeant would simply press the coin into a very drunk man's hand or slide it into his coat pocket while he was distracted, and the following morning, whatever the man remembered or did not remember, the sergeant would swear he had accepted it freely. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The shilling was never really the mechanism of the trap. The alcohol was. A sober man offered a shilling by a stranger in a red coat could simply say no and walk away. And plenty did exactly that every single evening across London. What the free pints and the hot food and the 2 or 3 hours of warm, flattering conversation actually purchased from the army's perspective was a version of Walter, whose judgment had been quietly dismantled by the time the coin appeared at all. He would remember later that a coin had been placed in his hand at some point in the evening. He would not remember with any confidence whether he had closed his fingers around it deliberately or simply failed to let it fall. Walter's own version of that moment, when it comes, is almost anticlimactic in how little ceremony surrounds it. It is past 10 at night. He has eaten a hot meal for the first time in 3 days and drunk more porter than he has consumed at one sitting in his entire life. And the sergeant, whose name Walter will later struggle to recall with any certainty, has been talking for the better part of an hour about a posting in India, where a man's pay goes further than it ever could in London. About a barracks that is warm in winter. About a life that, in the sergeant's telling, sounds less like a sacrifice than an escape. Somewhere in the middle of that hour, a coin appears on the table between them, or in Walter's hand. Or perhaps, as he will half remember, and never quite be certain of, in the bottom of his own tankard. He picks it up. He turns it over once in his fingers, the way anyone examines a coin, without a single conscious thought that the gesture itself was the entire transaction. The sergeant's face changes, very slightly, into something more satisfied than warm. "Well now," he says, something to that effect. "You've taken the Queen's shilling, my lad." And there it is. Done. Before Walter has fully understood there was anything to do. The broader context here matters as much as the moment itself. Recruitment law by 1888 technically offered a man in Walter's position a way out, a short window in which he could repudiate what had just happened and walk away. We will spend real time with that window and its cruel limitations. But the entire architecture of the recruiting pub was built to ensure that as few men as possible ever used it, by making certain that the moment of supposed agreement happened at the exact point in the evening when a man's capacity for sober reconsideration was at its lowest ebb. Every pint the sergeant bought, every extra half hour of conversation he stretched the evening into, was doing quiet, deliberate work toward that end. This was not incidental hospitality. It was the entire mechanism dressed up as generosity, and it worked precisely because generosity was the last thing anyone in that pub wanted Walter, or a magistrate, or a newspaper reader, the following week, to suspect it of being. There is something clarifying about knowing this. The image of the Victorian recruiting sergeant as a rough but essentially honest figure, offering an honest bargain to a willing man, depends entirely on ignoring what alcohol does to a hungry, exhausted body over the course of 3 unbroken hours of drinking on an empty stomach that has just been filled for the first time in days. Walter's body, in that moment, was not simply his own anymore in any meaningful sense. It was tired, undernourished, suddenly full of food and drink it was not accustomed to processing, and surrounded by warmth and attention it had been quietly starving for since his father died. The coin closing around his fingers was less a decision than a symptom, the last domino in a sequence the sergeant had spent the entire evening carefully arranging. He would wake the next morning and discover exactly how permanent that symptom had already become. If you picture the sort of man who enlisted in the Victorian army, you might imagine, thanks to a century of adventure fiction and regimental nostalgia, someone drawn by patriotism, by a taste for travel, by the simple romance of a uniform. A few men genuinely were, but the overwhelming majority of soldiers filling the ranks of Queen Victoria's late 19th century army were there for a reason far less glamorous and far more common, which was that they had run out of other options, and the army. The Duke of Wellington, a full 70 years before Walter's evening at the Mitre and Dove, is supposed to have described his own soldiers as the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink. A remark that has been quoted and argued over ever since, precisely because it was so bluntly accurate about who actually filled the ranks and so contemptuous of the men who did. By 1888, the phrase would have struck most officers as unfair, even old-fashioned. But the underlying economic reality it described had barely changed. The British Army did not draw its recruits evenly from across society. It drew them almost entirely from the bottom, from unemployed labourers, casual dockhands, agricultural workers pushed off the land by mechanization, and young men like Walter, whose family's single breadwinner had died or fallen ill, and left a household with no cushion at all. London, in the autumn of 1888, gave men like Walter very good reasons to be standing on that pavement. The city's casual labour market, the docks especially, hired men by the half-day with no promise of work tomorrow, a system that left tens of thousands of Londoners in a state of chronic, grinding uncertainty even in reasonably good years. The 1,880 seconds were not a reasonably good year. Unemployment across Britain had climbed sharply toward the end of the decade, reaching roughly 1 man in 10 out of work nationally by some contemporary estimates, and in London's poorer districts, Lambeth and Bermondsey and the East End. The real proportion of men without steady work at any given moment ran considerably higher than any national figure could capture. The social investigator, Charles Booth, was already walking those same streets in 1888, beginning the door-to-door survey that would become his famous poverty maps of London, colouring entire blocks black and dark blue for the very want and chronic want he found there. A project that would eventually confirm in exhaustive statistical detail what men like Walter already knew from the inside without needing a single map to tell them. Beneath the recruiting sergeant's talk of adventure and pay sat a much colder calculation that both he and Walter understood without ever quite saying it aloud. A private soldier's pay in 1888 was modest, roughly a shilling a day before deductions for food, laundry and equipment ate into it. Hardly a fortune by any measure, but it was regular. It arrived whether or not the docks were hiring, whether or not the weather had ruined a week's casual work, whether or not a man's own body had failed him that particular morning. For a labourer, accustomed to the dock's brutal unpredictability, the mere fact of a wage that showed up on schedule carried a psychological weight entirely disproportionate to its modest size. The army was not selling adventure to men like Walter, so much as it was selling certainty, a commodity in desperately short supply in his part of London, and it was selling that certainty at the cost of a commitment most of its buyers did not fully grasp they were making. For Walter's household specifically, the arithmetic was even starker than the general picture suggests. His wages, however irregular, had been the single largest and most reliable contribution to the 2 rooms in Lambeth he shared with his mother, his sister, and his brother. Without them, his mother's washing money and Ada's few coppers from minding neighbours' children would not come close to covering the rent, let alone food and coal through a winter that had already turned bitterly cold. The family's next stop, if Walter's wages disappeared entirely, was not an abstraction. It was the workhouse, an institution every poor Londoner understood in vivid, specific and thoroughly dreaded detail, one that separated husbands from wives and mothers from children and stripped away whatever dignity a family had managed to preserve through hard times. Walter had spent 6 weeks trying not to think too directly about that possibility. The sergeant, without ever mentioning the workhouse by name, had spent the same evening offering him what felt the warm light of the mitre and dove, like a way to make sure it never came to that. This is the detail the recruiting posters, with their tigers and their gleaming bayonets, worked hardest to obscure, and it is the detail modern popular memory of Victorian soldiering still tends to skip past. Enlistment was not, for the vast majority of men who took the shilling in pubs like this one, a career choice weighed against other reasonable alternatives. It was closer to an emergency exit taken by men who had already exhausted every other option available to someone with no capital, no connections, and no cushion against a bad month. The sergeants outside the mitre and dove were not competing with other employers for Walter's labour. They were competing, in a manner of speaking, with the workhouse, and against that particular alternative, a warm meal, a regular wage, and a story about India were not a hard sell at all. And critically, the men making that particular bargain rarely understood, in the moment, just how completely it would remove every other choice from their lives going forward. Walter, sitting in the warmth of the pub with a full stomach for the first time in days, was thinking about his mother's rent and his sister's coppers and the coal bin at home that was nearly empty. He was not thinking about India specifically, or about disease, or about how many years would pass before he saw Lambeth again. The sergeant had made very sure of that, and the arithmetic of Walter's poverty had done the rest of the work for him, quietly, all evening, without either of them needing to say so out loud. If you imagine the morning after a night like Walter's, you might picture something formal, a young man sitting upright at a desk, reading over a document, signing his name with due deliberation before witnesses. That image belongs to a world of contracts drawn up in daylight between men with equal information and equal sobriety. The actual morning after a Victorian recruiting pub bore almost no resemblance to it. Walter wakes some hours later on a hard cot in a room he does not recognize, with a headache that feels less like discomfort and more like a physical event still actively happening inside his skull. His mouth is dry in a way that suggests he was sick at some point during the night, though he has no memory of it. His stomach, unused to the volume of rich food and porter he consumed the previous evening, rebels the moment he tries to sit upright. Around him are perhaps a dozen other young men in similar states of disrepair, some groaning quietly, some sitting with their heads in their hands, all of them wearing the particular expression of men trying to reconstruct a sequence of decisions. This room belongs to what the army called a recruiting house or receiving depot, a plain, functional building where sergeants brought the previous night's takings to be held, fed, and sobered up sufficiently to be marched before a magistrate for the formal business of attestation. The reconstruction of the previous evening does not come easily. Accounts collected from soldiers describing their own enlistments, preserved in regimental histories and personal memoirs from across the period, describe a remarkably consistent pattern, a fog of half-memories, a coin someone recalls holding, a sergeant's face and voice more clearly remembered than anything the man himself said. Doubleter's own memory runs along exactly this pattern. He remembers the fire, he remembers the food and the porter, and the sergeant's unhurried, comfortable voice describing pay that arrived on schedule. He remembers, with a clarity that unsettles him more than the gaps do, turning a small coin over in his fingers at some point, though he could not say with any honesty whether he closed his hand around it deliberately or simply failed to let it drop. What he does not remember, and what nobody in the room particularly wants him to remember, is anyone using the word soldier or army or enlistment in a sentence direct enough that refusing it would have felt like an obvious, available option. A sergeant, not the same warm, attentive man from the previous evening, but a brisker figure with paperwork under his arm, moves through the room explaining in the tone of a man who has delivered this particular news several hundred times before, that every man present took the Queen's shilling last night, that this makes them recruits pending formal attestation, and that they will be marched to appear before a magistrate within the day to complete the process properly. He says this plainly, almost kindly, the way one might inform a patient of a diagnosis rather than a defendant of a charge, and that tone matters because it forecloses, before any of these hungover young men have had time to fully think, the question of whether what happened to them last night was actually fair. For Walter, sitting on the edge of the cot with his head pounding and his stomach still uncertain, the news lands less as a shock than as a slow sinking confirmation of something he had half suspected the moment he woke up in an unfamiliar room. He thinks, immediately and with a clarity his hangover has not managed to dull. Of his mother, of Ada and Sam, of the rent that will not wait for him to sort out his feelings about any of this. He thinks, more slowly and with a kind of dawning horror that he tries to push back down, of India, of the sergeant's stories about elephants and paydays, stories that had sounded 12 hours ago in a warm pub with a full stomach, like an escape, and now sound in a cold receiving house with a headache, like a sentence. The broader mechanics of this system deserve to be understood plainly, because they were not accidental. The gap between the coin and the magistrate, deliberately structured by the recruiting parties who ran these houses, existed to hold men in exactly the disoriented, physically compromised state Walter is currently experiencing for as long as legally possible before they were required to make any further decision. A recruit sober enough to walk straight and think clearly might use the hours before attestation to reconsider, to seek out a friend or a clergyman, or simply enough fresh air to clear his head. A recruit still working through the physical aftermath of an unaccustomed night's drinking, surrounded by other men in the identical condition, in a building he does not know, being addressed by uniformed men who speak with calm institutional authority. The recruit whose capacity for genuine reconsideration has been very deliberately narrowed to almost nothing. There is something worth sitting with in how ordinary this all felt to everyone involved except the recruits themselves. The brisk sergeant with his paperwork was not committing a crime. He was following a system that Parliament itself had built and repeatedly declined to reform. A system in which a night's drinking, orchestrated by a paid recruiting agent, could produce a legal obligation binding a man's body to imperial service for years. Walter, sick, frightened, and increasingly aware of exactly how little control he currently had over what happened to him next, was about to discover that the law did in fact offer him one narrow chance to undo what the previous evening had done. He was also about to discover exactly how carefully that chance had been designed to be useless to someone in his position. If you assume Victorian law offered a drunk recruit no protection at all, you are only half right, and the half that is wrong matters enormously to what happens to Walter next. English military law, going back through successive mutiny acts and carried forward into the Army Act that governed enlistment in 1888, did technically grant a newly enlisted man a window in which to change his mind. A period of not less than 24 hours and not more than 96, in which he could repudiate his enlistment before it became fully binding. On paper, this looks like a genuine safeguard, a legal acknowledgement that men taken in by a recruiting sergeant's hospitality deserved a sober chance to reconsider. In practice, for a man in Walter's position, it was closer to a locked door with a visible handle. The mechanism worked like this. A recruit who wished to withdraw within his window had to repay the shilling he had accepted, along with what the law and the recruiting parties themselves called smart money, a further sum, commonly set at 21 shillings, plus whatever cost the army had already incurred feeding and housing him since he took the coin. 21 shillings was, by the standards of a man like Walter, an enormous amount of money to produce on short notice, more than 3 weeks of a private soldier's basic pay, and far beyond what an unemployed casual labourer with a family depending on him could possibly assemble within a single day. If he could not produce this sum, the law was unambiguous about what happened next. He was deemed to have duly enlisted, and he was marched before a magistrate to complete his attestation, whether his sobriety, his family's circumstances, or his own second thoughts had anything further to say about it. Sit with the shape of that requirement for a moment, because it reveals exactly who this supposed protection was built to serve. A young man from a comfortable family who had enlisted on a whim in a fit of pique after an argument with his father, or simply out of youthful romanticism about the uniform, could send word home, receive 21 shillings and a scolding by the next post, and walk away from the whole affair within his window with nothing worse than an embarrassing story. This did happen, and regimental officers of the period grumbled openly about the number of well-connected young men who used the grace period exactly this way, treating enlistment as a reversible lark. For a man like Walter, with no savings, no property, and a family that could not produce 21 shillings between them if their lives depended on it, which in a meaningful sense they did, the same law offered nothing at all. The right to buy back his freedom existed in the statute book, with perfect equality between rich and poor recruits. The capacity to actually exercise that right existed almost nowhere in London south of the river. Walter does the arithmetic himself, sitting in the receiving house with his head still pounding, and it takes him only a few minutes to arrive at the number he already suspected he would find. His family's entire liquid resources, every coin his mother has managed to keep aside against the rent, would not add up to a third of what smart money required, and even if it somehow did, spending it on his own release would leave the household with nothing at all to face the coming week, let alone the winter. There is no one else to ask. He has no employer to appeal to, no patron, no clergyman who knows him well enough to advance so large a sum on his behalf. He has, in the most literal financial sense available to him, no way to say no to what happened last night, even though a piece of paper somewhere in the War Office's own regulations insists that saying no was technically his right all along. The story rarely ends with the coin itself, though most retellings of the Queen's shilling stop right there, as though the moment of acceptance were the whole of the trap. The truth is that the coin was only the first lock. The 24-hour window, dressed up as mercy, was the second, and it was specifically engineered so that mercy remained available in theory to precisely the men who needed it least. Historians of Victorian military law, including Edward Spires in his broader survey of the late Victorian army, have pointed to this exact asymmetry as one of the clearest illustrations of how thoroughly enlistment law, whatever its stated intentions, functioned as a mechanism for extracting soldiers from the poor rather than a truly neutral contract between equals. A safeguard that only the wealthy could afford to use is not really a safeguard. It is a courtesy extended to the people. The system was least interested in trapping in the first place. There is a further, quieter cruelty buried in the mechanism, one easy to miss, unless you sit with it the way Walter was forced to. The smart money requirement did not simply fail to help poor recruits. It actively punished the appearance of poverty itself, treating a man's inability to produce 21 shillings on demand as proof that his original acceptance of the coin must have been sound and considered, when the far more obvious explanation that he had nothing to his name because destitution was the very condition the recruiting sergeant had been hunting for in the first place, went entirely unexamined by the law. The system took men because they were poor, and then used their poverty as evidence that taking them had been fair. By the following afternoon, Walter is marched, along with the other men from the receiving house, to appear before a magistrate for the formal ceremony of attestation, the true legal moment at which enlistment became irreversible under any circumstances, 21 shillings or not. He answers the questions put to him honestly, his age, his trade, his willingness to serve, because the alternative, a charge of making a false statement, carries penalties considerably worse than the ones he is already facing. He swears the oath of allegiance in a room that smells of dust and old paper, his voice steadier than he expects it to be, and somewhere in the middle of that brief procedural ceremony, the young bootmaker's apprentice from Lambeth stops existing in any legal sense, and a private soldier of Her Majesty's army takes his place instead. What remains to be seen, and what nobody in that room bothers to mention to him, is whether his body is actually fit enough by the army's own strange and self-serving standards to survive what comes next. If you picture a Victorian army medical examination, you probably imagine something rigorous, a careful gatekeeping process designed to ensure that only truly fit young men were sent off to represent the crown, sparing the unfit the ordeal, and sparing the army the expense of a soldier who could not keep pace on the march. The paperwork certainly looked rigorous. Recruits were measured for height, for chest circumference both relaxed and fully expanded, examined for vision, for the condition of their limbs and joints, for their general physical development, and for their teeth. Categories precise enough to fill a standardized form with neat columns and exact figures. What the paperwork did not disclose, and what a young man standing half-dressed in a cold examination room in 1888 had no way of knowing, was who was actually being paid to fill those columns in, and how that arrangement quietly undermined the entire premise of the exam. Army surgeons responsible for examining recruits during this period were compensated in part by a fee of 1 shilling for every man they passed as fit for service. This detail sounds small, almost administrative, until you consider what it actually incentivized. A surgeon paid only for approvals and paid nothing extra for the more time-consuming, more socially awkward business of rejecting a hopeful young man who badly needed the wage, had a direct financial reason to interpret every borderline case generously. Contemporary critics and later historians examining recruitment records from this era have pointed to exactly this arrangement as a structural explanation for why so many men who were, by any honest physical standard, poorly nourished, undersized, carrying old injuries nonetheless, found themselves past fit and marched off toward a barracks within days of standing on that examination room floor. The exam looked like science. Underneath the columns, the careful measurements, it functioned considerably more like a transaction between two men, the surgeon and the War Office, in which the recruit's actual body was almost incidental to the outcome. Walter's own examination follows this pattern closely enough to be almost unremarkable. He undresses in a cold, plainly furnished room alongside several of the other men from the receiving house, an experience that is its own particular indignity for a young man raised to a fairly strict sense of physical modesty, one more small humiliation stacked on top of a day already full of them. The surgeon measures his height, just barely clearing the minimum the infantry required that year, a bar set deliberately lower for foot soldiers than for cavalry or the socially prestigious foot guards, precisely because the infantry needed far greater numbers and could not afford to be choosy. He measures Walter's chest, both at rest and with his lungs fully expanded, a figure that comes in adequate rather than impressive, unsurprising in a young man who has not eaten a full regular diet in several months. He checks Walter's teeth, category that had mattered enormously earlier in the century, when soldiers were required to tear open paper cartridges with their teeth to load a muzzle-loading rifle, and mattered rather less by 1888, now that the Army's standard Martini Henry rifle, though the inspection persisted out of institutional habit even as its original purpose quietly evaporated. He checks Walter's eyes, his limbs, his general bearing, and pronounces him, within a matter of minutes, fit for service. There is no dramatic moment of near rejection in Walter's story, and that absence is itself the point worth noticing. He is thin. He is undernourished in the specific, chronic way that months of irregular meals produce. He carries, though nobody examines closely enough to notice it, a persistent, dull ache in one wrist from years of repetitive work with an awl that a more careful physician might have flagged as an early sign of joint strain. None of this troubles the surgeon in the slightest, because none of this is actually what the examination was designed to catch. The exam existed to screen out the catastrophically unfit, men who were blind, or missing limbs, or suffering from an obvious disqualifying disease, while waving through the enormous, unglamorous middle ground of merely undernourished, merely tired, merely poor young men that made up the overwhelming bulk Britain's actual recruiting pool. Walter passes not because his body is particularly suited to soldiering, but because the entire system had been quietly calibrated, shilling by shilling, to make passing the ordinary outcome rather than the exception. Broader context here connects directly back to everything that has already happened to Walter that day. The Empire needed a very large number of soldiers, considerably larger than the pool of well-fed, sturdily built young Englishmen could supply, especially once the more comfortable classes had opted out of enlistment almost entirely. Given that mismatch, the medical examination could either function as a genuine bottleneck, sharply reducing the number of men available for imperial service, or it could function as a formality that mostly rubber-stamped whoever the recruiting sergeants had already delivered. The fee structure paid to army surgeons made the second outcome all but inevitable, and it did so quietly without requiring anyone in the chain of command to issue an explicit instruction to lower standards. Nobody needed to tell the surgeon to be lenient. His own pay packet did that work for him, every single time a hesitant, borderline recruit stood in front of him hoping to be waved through. There is something worth pausing on in how thoroughly this arrangement inverted the exam's supposed purpose without ever technically breaking a single rule. A process built, at least in its official language, to protect both the army and the recruit from a poor physical match, had been quietly restructured through nothing more than a modest fee into a process whose real function was simply to keep the pipeline moving. Walter walks out of that examination room officially certified as fit for Her Majesty's service, a judgment that has almost nothing to do with the actual condition of his body and everything to do with the shilling that judgment earned the man who delivered it. He is, as far as any official record will ever show, a healthy young soldier. He is also, as his own body could have told anyone who bothered to ask it properly, tired, underfed, and about to be handed a rifle, a uniform, and a training regimen designed for men considerably better provisioned than he currently is. Now, the making of the soldier himself. Because everything that happened to Walter at the Mitre and Dove, the coin, the hangover, the impossible arithmetic of smart money, the medical exam that waved him through without truly seeing him, was only the entry fee. What came next was the actual manufacturing process, and it was designed with a thoroughness that would have impressed any Victorian factory owner, to take the raw material of a 19-year-old bootmaker's apprentice and turn it into something the army could actually use. If you picture Victorian basic training, you might imagine something roughly analogous to modern military boot camp, demanding and unpleasant, but ultimately protective, hardening a young man's body for the dangers ahead, while teaching him skills that will keep him alive. Some of that is true. Much of it obscures how deliberately the process was built around obedience rather than survival, and how little regard it had for the individual body passing through it. Under the regimental depot system that Edward Cardwell had put in place through his reforms of the 1872nd, each infantry regiment maintained a fixed depot tied to a specific home district, a permanent institution where new recruits like Walter were gathered, drilled, and hardened before being posted to their regiment's active battalion. Frequently stationed overseas, Walter's own depot, a collection of brick barrack blocks, not unlike the ones being expanded around the same period at Aldershot, becomes his entire world for the following weeks, a world organized down to the hour-around drill. Drill itself deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it was never simply physical training in the way a modern reader might assume. Hour after hour, day after day, recruits were marched, wheeled, and formed into ranks under the barked instruction of drill sergeants whose entire purpose was to produce, through sheer repetition, a body that obeyed a shouted command before its owner had consciously registered the words. This was not incidental to soldiering. It was arguably the central skill the army needed from Walter, considerably more central than marksmanship or fitness, because an army built from thousands of individual working men could only function as an army if each of those men had been drilled into responding to orders faster than he could think to question them. Walter's own name, his history, his singing voice, his private vanity about a life that might have taken him somewhere better than the docks, none of it mattered to the drill sergeant shouting at his formation. What mattered was his position in the rank, his number, and the speed of his response. Discipline, when a recruit fell short of what drill demanded, had grown somewhat less brutal by 1888 than it had been earlier in the century. Though less brutal is a relative term worth examining honestly rather than taking at face value. Flogging, the lash that had disciplined British soldiers for roughly 2 centuries, was formally abolished across the army in 1881, only 7 years before Walter's own enlistment, following a long and bitterly contested debate in Parliament. In its place, the army adopted what it called field punishment, a system under which an offending soldier could be bound, hands and feet, to a fixed post or a gun wheel, for up to 2 hours a day across a period of weeks, a punishment soldiers themselves came to call crucifixion, precisely because a body immobilized and displayed in front of an entire barracks accomplished, through humiliation rather than the whip, much of what flogging had once accomplished through pain. The specific technology of correction had changed. The underlying premise that a soldier's body belonged to the army, in a sense his civilian body never had, remained exactly where it had always been. Walter, by most fortunate accounts, a fairly compliant and quick-learning recruit, avoids the worst of this discipline in his early weeks, though he watches it applied to others closely enough to understand precisely what awaits any man who does not learn the new rhythms of his life quickly. He learns to fold his kit with mathematical precision. He learns to hold his rifle at a series of exact angles that mean nothing to him personally, and everything to the sergeant, affecting his formation. He learns the specific cadence of commands that will, within a matter of weeks, become so deeply grooved into his body that he will find himself responding to a shouted order even in his sleep. He is issued a service number, and though he keeps his own name, he begins to notice, with a mixture of resentment and something close to relief, that the number matters more to the institution around him than the name ever did. The broader context matters here as much as anywhere in this story. By the terms established under the Childers Reforms of 1881, a man enlisting into the infantry in 1888 committed, in theory, to 7 years of active service with his regiment's colours, followed by a further 5 years in the reserve, a considerably shorter, more humane term than the 21-year lifetime enlistments that had trapped earlier generations of British soldiers, and a genuine reform worth acknowledging honestly, rather than folding into a simpler story of unrelieved Victorian cruelty. But 7 years remained an extraordinary span of a young man's life to sign away in a single drunken evening, particularly for a recruit whose real understanding of what those 7 years would actually demand of his body had been carefully kept vague by everyone with a financial stake in his signature. Walter had traded an unpredictable, precarious civilian existence for a highly predictable, tightly controlled military one, and predictability, it turns out, is not remotely the same thing as safety. Soldiers of this era had already acquired a popular nickname, Tommy Atkins, a generic name used on specimen paperwork that had drifted into common usage as shorthand for the ordinary British private, affectionate in tone and faintly diminishing in effect. The sort of nickname reserved for a figure the public found easy to romanticize, precisely because it rarely had to look closely at what that figure actually experienced. Walter is becoming a Tommy Atkins now, in the fullest sense the term implied, a body drilled into uniform obedience, identified by number as much as by name, and about to be shipped, along with several hundred other freshly minted Tommy Atkinses, toward one of the specific overseas postings that made the phrase Queen's shilling carry. For anyone who understood the actual odds involved, considerably more weight than a mere figure of speech. If you imagine the death of a Victorian soldier posted overseas, you probably picture something out of the recruiting posters themselves: a dramatic last stand, a bayonet charge, a moment of battlefield heroism that at least gave his death a shape and a story his family could hold on to. Some soldiers did die exactly that way, and their names sometimes made the London papers. The overwhelming majority of British soldiers who died in imperial service during this period, however, died of causes that never appeared on a single recruiting poster, in beds rather than on battlefields, killed by organisms too small to see. Walter's own regiment, once his training at the depot concludes, receives orders that fold him into the enormous, unglamorous machinery of imperial garrison duty, routine business of holding territory that occupied the vast majority of a Victorian soldier's actual service, war or no war. India remained the single largest overseas commitment for the British Army throughout this period, a vast subcontinent requiring a permanent garrison of tens of thousands of European troops to maintain colonial control. For a young man from Lambeth who had never previously travelled further than a day trip to the coast, the posting itself was disorienting on a scale difficult to overstate. An entirely unfamiliar climate, unfamiliar food, unfamiliar disease, and months of travel by troopship simply to arrive at the barracks where his actual service would begin. The historian Philip Curtin, whose research specifically examined European military mortality across the tropical world during the 19th century, documented in careful statistical detail what garrison life in places like India actually cost the bodies sent there. And the numbers are stark enough to reframe the entire romantic mythology of imperial soldiering. Cholera alone killed British soldiers in India at a rate dramatically higher than it killed the Indian soldiers serving alongside them. The gap researchers have traced the differences in exposure, immunity, and the simple fact that European troops crowded into poorly ventilated barracks with inadequate sanitation provided ideal conditions for an epidemic to take hold and spread. Earlier in the century, before significant reform, mortality rates among European soldiers in parts of India had run as high as 7 or 8 men in every 100 per year. A toll that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with contaminated water, poor drainage, and barracks built without the faintest consideration for the diseases that thrived in a hot, densely populated garrison town. Some of this had markedly improved by the time Walter's regiment embarked. Following the shock of the 1857 uprising, the British government had commissioned a Royal Commission on the Sanitary State of the Army in India, a project Florence Nightingale herself pushed for and shaped from behind the scenes despite never travelling to India in person, using statistical evidence to argue, successfully, that better drainage, cleaner water, An improved barrack design could cut the death toll dramatically without spending a single additional shilling on weapons or fortifications. By the 1882, mortality rates among European troops in India had fallen substantially from their mid-century peaks, a genuine, well-documented public health achievement, but substantially lower than catastrophic still left disease as, by a wide margin, the leading cause of death among British soldiers stationed there, and a healthy young recruit like Walter, freshly arrived, with no accumulated immunity to diseases his body had never previously encountered, remained considerably more vulnerable than the seasoned veterans he would be serving alongside. India was not the only posting that carried this particular kind of risk, and for soldiers whose service records sent them instead toward the west coast of Africa, the odds were considerably worse. The Gold Coast and the surrounding coastal stations had earned, well before Walter's own time, the grim and largely accurate nickname of the white man's grave, a reputation built on decades of documented experience with malaria and yellow fever that killed European soldiers and administrators willing to accept significant losses in pursuit of imperial goals. Historians studying the successive British campaigns against the Asante Kingdom across the 19th century have noted that disease, rather than Asante resistance, accounted for a large share of British casualties, a pattern consistent and well documented enough that commanders planning West African deployments had to factor disease losses into their calculations as routinely as they factored in ammunition supply. And for men whose regiments were drawn instead toward the Egyptian and Sudanese frontier, the specific theatre where British and Egyptian forces continued to skirmish with Mahdist fighters throughout the late 1882, the dangers of combat and disease arrived together. In December of 1888, the very same year Walter took the Queen's Shilling outside the Mitre and Dove, a British and Egyptian force under General Francis Grenfell fought and defeated a Mahdist army near the Sudanese port of Suakin, in which official reports recorded a dozen British and Egyptian casualties against roughly 1,000 Mahdist dead, a lopsided outcome by the standards of Victorian colonial warfare, but a genuine, documented reminder that some regiments recruited that year would face bullets. None of this was explained to Walter, or to any of the other young men who took the Shilling outside the Mitre and Dove, with anything approaching the clarity the actual statistics deserved. The recruiting sergeant's stories about India had described pay, climate, and adventure. They had not described cholera mortality tables, or the particular way dysentery could reduce a healthy young man to a shadow of himself within a matter of weeks, or the fact that a soldier posted to West Africa faced a materially worse set of odds than one posted to India, odds that had nothing to do with his own courage, skill, fitness, and everything to do with which garrison town his orders happened to name. Walter had accepted a coin, sworn an oath, endured a medical exam, and survived a training depot without ever once being given an honest account of the actual mortality risk attached to the specific posting he might draw, because an honest account of that risk was precisely the sort of information the entire recruiting apparatus, from the sergeant's warm smile to the surgeon's shilling fee, had been constructed to keep from reaching him before his signature was already secured. There is something worth sitting with in the sheer scale of this gap between reputation and reality. The empire needed young bodies to hold its garrisons, and it needed those bodies to arrive in a state of comparative ignorance about what holding those garrisons actually cost, because a fully informed 19-year-old weighing his real odds against the workhouse might have hesitated a little longer outside a pub like the Mitre and Dove. The entire machinery Walter had passed through, the drink, the coin, the impossible smart money, the lenient surgeon, the drill that replaced his name with a number, existed in part to ensure that hesitation never had the chance to fully form. He was, By the time his troopship left English waters, healthy young private soldier, according to every official record that mattered, sailing toward a set of odds considerably worse than any recruiting poster had ever cared to print. If you assume that a private soldier's family back home received some measure of institutional support once he sailed for India or the Sudan or the Gold Coast, official recognition of the sacrifice his absence represented, you would be assuming something the Victorian army went to considerable lengths. Walter was not married, which placed his mother, Ada, and Sam entirely outside the one narrow category of dependence the army acknowledged at all. The regimental marriage system of this period, examined in detail by the historian Mina Trustram in her study of Victorian army wives, operated on a strict and deliberately limited quota. Only a fixed proportion of men in any given regiment, commonly around 6 or 7 in every 100, were permitted to marry with what the army called official sanction, granting their wives a place on the regimental strength, and with it a modest claim to rations, quarters, and a degree of institutional recognition, should their husbands be posted overseas or killed in service. Every other soldier's wife, and by extension every other soldier's mother, sister, or younger sibling depending on his wages, existed entirely outside that system, entitled to nothing, acknowledged by no regimental paperwork, and left to manage the consequences of his absence. Walter, a private soldier with no wife at all, left behind a mother and 2 younger siblings who had no claim whatsoever on the institution that had just taken their breadwinner across an ocean. What this meant, in the specific and unglamorous terms of Walter's own household, was that his enlistment did not simply remove him from Lambeth. It removed, in one stroke, the family's primary source of income, replacing it with nothing the army considered its business to replace. A soldier could, if he chose and if his own pay allowed it, arrange a voluntary allotment sending a portion of his wages home, and some men did exactly that, scraping a few pence together out of a shilling a day already reduced by deductions for food, laundry and equipment. But a shilling a day divided against barrack deductions left very little margin for a young private to send meaningfully large sums back to Lambeth, and the timing of any such allotment, delayed by the slow mail routes connecting an overseas garrison to London, offered no help at all during the immediate weeks after Walter's departure. Precisely the weeks in which his mother's rent came due, with no adjustment for her son's newly reduced circumstances. Ada, at 11, took on more of the household's income-generating work than an 11-year-old should reasonably have had to carry, minding more neighborhood children for more hours, doing it because the alternative, her mother explained to her with the flat, exhausted honesty poverty tends to produce in parents who have run out of gentler options, was the workhouse for all 3 of them. Walter's mother took in more washing than her hands could comfortably manage, developing the raw, cracked skin that was practically an occupational marker for Victorian washerwomen, a physical cost of labor as real in its own quiet way as anything her son's body would face overseas, though nobody would ever write a recruiting poster about it. Sam, at 8, was old enough to understand that his brother had gone away and not entirely old enough to understand why, and he asked about Walter's return with a persistence that his mother found it increasingly difficult to answer honestly, because she genuinely did not know when or whether her eldest child would come home. This is the piece of the recruiting pub's mythology that the warm firelight and the sergeant's easy laugh worked hardest to keep out of frame entirely. The scene outside the Mitre and Dove, redcoats and polish boots, and stories of adventure, presented enlistment as an act concerning one man alone, a private decision about his own future, weighed against his own prospects. The actual consequences of that decision radiated outward through an entire household that had no vote in it whatsoever. A mother, a sister, and a younger brother whose daily survival now depended on a wage that no longer arrived, an institution that owed them nothing, and a young man thousands of miles away who could send home a few pence a month once the mail eventually caught up with him. The broader pattern here connects directly to everything the recruiting sergeants understood about their trade and rarely said aloud. A man with genuine financial responsibilities to a family that could not survive without him made, from a purely cold-blooded recruiting perspective, an excellent target precisely because his desperation ran deep enough to override caution, while simultaneously representing exactly the sort of recruit whose enlistment would inflict the most collateral damage on people who had never set foot inside the Mitre and Dove at all. The Army's institutional indifference to that collateral damage was not an oversight. It was baked into a marriage and dependency system deliberately kept narrow enough to limit the Crown's financial obligations, a system that treated the domestic wreckage left behind by enlistment as somebody else's problem to solve if it could be solved at all. There is something worth pausing on here, something closer to recognition than judgment. Walter's mother did not blame her son for what happened outside that pub. Understanding, in the way poor Londoners of her generation generally understood such things without needing it explained, that the coin had found him rather than the other way around. What she carried instead, through that winter and the ones that followed, was a specific, unglamorous form of endurance that never once appeared in any recruiting literature. The quiet, daily work of keeping 2 children fed and housed on wages that had been cut by more than half overnight, hoping that whatever her son was facing on the other side of the world, disease, discipline, or the frontier, fighting the newspapers occasionally mentioned in passing, would eventually let him come home to her. Which brings us to the question that nobody asked in polite conversation about the Victorian Army, but that every recruiting sergeant, every drill instructor, and every man standing at attention in a barracks square privately understood to be hanging over the entire enterprise. If so many soldiers had been talked, tricked, or drunkenly maneuvered into a service they would never have chosen with a clear head, how many of them simply walked away the moment an opportunity presented itself? The answer, preserved in regimental returns across the period, is considerably higher than the popular image of the obedient, uncomplaining Tommy Atkins would suggest. Some regiments recorded desertion rates reaching a fifth or even a third of their recruits within the earliest months of service, a staggering figure that reveals, more clearly than almost any other statistic from this world, exactly how many enlistments had been secured through methods the men themselves regretted the moment: sobriety, homesickness, or simple horror. Had barracks life set back in. Desertion was not a rare, scandalous exception in the late Victorian Army. For a meaningful share of new recruits, it was closer to a second, quieter act of the same drama that had begun outside a pub, like the Mitre and Dove. The moment a man finally found the nerve, or the desperation, to do what the 24-hour window and the smart money requirement had made legally and financially impossible for him to do on the morning after. The consequences of running when a man was caught had grown somewhat less severe by 1888 than they had been within living memory of the older sergeants training him. For much of the earlier 19th century, a soldier convicted of desertion by court-martial could be branded, a small metal instrument driven against the skin below the left armpit to leave the letter D permanently visible, a mark intended to prevent a deserter from simply re-enlisting under a different name in another regiment. Thousands of men carried that mark by the middle of the century, a permanent, involuntary tattoo recording a decision made in a single desperate moment. The practice had been abandoned by the time Walter enlisted, quietly discontinued over the previous decade as part of the same broader halting movement toward less physically punitive discipline that had also ended flogging. Though some of the older veterans training Walter's intake still carried the D on their own skin from service earlier in their careers, a visible reminder to every new recruit of exactly how the Army had once handled the men who tried to leave it. By 1888, The punishment for desertion had shifted from mutilation to imprisonment, a court-martial and a stretch in military detention, followed by a return to the very regiment the man had tried to escape, now marked in every less permanent sense a soldier could be marked, watched more closely, and burdened with a service record that would follow him for the remainder of his term. Walter, for what it is worth, never seriously considers running, and the reasons why say as much about the trap he is caught in as any statistic about the men who did. Desertion would have meant forfeiting what little pay he had managed to allot home, replacing an unreliable but real contribution to his mother's rent with nothing at all, while adding the very genuine risk of imprisonment on top of a family situation that could not absorb the loss of even his reduced irregular support. The same economic desperation that had delivered him into the recruiting sergeant's hands outside the Mitre and Dove now worked, with a kind of grim symmetry, to keep him inside the very institution that desperation had trapped him in. Because the risks of leaving fell not only on Walter, but on a mother and two younger siblings who had never set foot in a barracks and had no say in the calculation at all. This is where the broader pattern becomes visible if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The men who deserted successfully were disproportionately the ones with somewhere else to go. A family that could absorb the loss of their support, a trade they could quietly return to under an assumed name. Resources that made the gamble of running worth the risk. The men who stayed, often not out of loyalty or contentment, but out of the same grinding economic necessity that had put them in uniform in the first place, were frequently the ones with the least to fall back on if the gamble went wrong. The army, without designing the system explicitly for this outcome, had built a structure in which its most economically vulnerable recruits were also its least likely to escape it, bound not by the coin any longer, but by the same unforgiving domestic arithmetic that had brought them to the recruiting sergeant's attention to begin with. There is something worth sitting with in how little any of this had to do with courage, patriotism, or the qualities the regimental histories like to celebrate in their soldiers. A man who deserted was not necessarily a coward, and a man who stayed was not necessarily brave. Each was navigating, as best he could, a set of financial constraints largely invisible to the officers commanding him, and the army's own discipline. Its courts-martial and its detention barracks functioned in practice as a kind of tax on desperation, punishing most severely the men who had the least room left to maneuver around it. Walter stayed, month after month, year after year, for his mother's sake and Ada's and Sam's, and the loyalty this produced in him, real as it eventually became, had started his life as something considerably closer to a debt he had no way of refusing to pay. If you assume that a soldier who survived his 7 years with the colours returned home to a grateful welcome and a smooth transition back into civilian life, the sort of homecoming the same recruiting posters that had lured him in liked to imply awaited every Tommy Atkins who served his time honourably. The actual record of what happened to time-expired soldiers tells a considerably less comforting story. Some men, it must be said honestly, did return more or less intact, having drawn a fortunate posting, avoided the worst epidemics, and come through their service with their health and their prospects reasonably preserved. But a substantial number of soldiers left the army earlier than their original term specified, discharged, not through any fault of their own, but because disease, chronic injury, or simple physical breakdown had rendered them no longer fit for the duties the army required of them. A medical discharge of this kind carried no guarantee of meaningful ongoing support. The pension system available to an ordinary time-expired or medically discharged private in this period was modest at best, often amounting to a small weekly sum that fell well short of what a man needed to actually live on, particularly if his health had been sufficiently damaged by his service. That steady civilian labor was no longer straightforwardly available to him. Cardwell's reforms had introduced a scheme of deferred pay, a lump sum a soldier could draw upon completing his term, intended to ease exactly this transition. But the sum involved was rarely large enough to function as anything more than a temporary cushion against the much larger problem of re-entering a labor market that had moved on without him. Walter, as it happens, is one of the fortunate ones, though fortunate is a word that requires some qualification once you understand what it actually cost him to earn it. He serves his full 7 years with the colors, most of them in India, surviving 2 serious bouts of dysentery that leave him permanently thinner and more prone to digestive trouble than he had been as a 19-year-old, along with a case of malarial fever contracted during a brief attachment to a unit operating nearer the coast, and in milder form at intervals for the rest of his life. He is not wounded in combat, though he sees enough of it during the ongoing frontier operations of his later service years to understand, in a way, the recruiting sergeant's stories never conveyed, what the difference actually looks like between a campaign medal and the men who did not live to receive one. When his 7 years finally conclude, he transfers into the reserve rather than re-enlisting, collects his modest deferred pay, boards a troopship home to a London he has not seen in the better part of a decade. The Lambeth he returns to is not quite the Lambeth he left. His mother has aged more than 7 years should have aged her, the accumulated toll of washing other people's linen for a decade of scraped-together income finally visible in her hands and her back. Ada, 11 when he left, is a young woman of 18 now, working respectably in a shop and no longer dependent on him in the way she once was, a fact that brings him a complicated mixture of relief and a quiet, unexpected grief at having missed the years. Sam, 8 when Walter sailed, is a young man of 15, apprenticed to a trade of his own, who greets his returning brother with a shy, searching curiosity, trying to reconcile the stranger standing in their doorway, thinner, weathered, carrying himself with a rigid, drilled posture that never entirely leaves a man who has spent 7 years responding to shouted commands, with the boy's half-remembered image of an older brother who used to sing on Sunday evenings for pennies. Walter's own singing voice, when he tries it again in the weeks after his return, is still there, though something in it has changed, a certain roughness at the edges that his mother, listening, chooses not to mention. He finds work more easily than many returning soldiers manage, in part because a spell of army labor has left him with a discipline and physical steadiness that a few employers value, and in part because Lambeth, in the 1890 seconds, unlike Lambeth in 1888, is not gripped by quite the same acute unemployment crisis. He is, in this narrow, hard-won sense, one of the lucky ones, a fact he understands with a clarity he could not have possessed at 19, because he has by now seen in barracks hospitals, in India, and in the faces of men discharged before him, for reasons the Army's paperwork described only in the driest possible language. Exactly how many of the young men who stood beside him outside the Mitre and Dove that November evening did not come home at all, or came home changed in ways considerably worse than a slightly rougher singing voice and a permanent wariness around unfamiliar redcoats. The broader record bears out just how narrow that luck actually was. Contemporary observers of London's poorest districts in the years following Walter's return, among them the American writer, social investigator Jack London, whose later account of London's East End slums documented a visible population of former soldiers among the casual poor, men whose service had left them with damaged health, few transferable skills, and pensions too small to function as real support, described exactly the pattern Walter had watched play out around him in barracks and hospital boards for the better part of a decade. Time-expired soldiers did not disappear cleanly back into the civilian economy. The recruiting posters had implied they came from. Many rejoined the same precarious casual labor world that had made them vulnerable to a recruiting sergeant's offer in the first place. Now, carrying additional physical damage the army had inflicted on top of the poverty it had originally promised to solve. There is something worth pausing on in the shape of Walter's entire journey, from the cold pavement outside the Mitre and Dove to the doorway of his mother's rooms in Lambeth nearly a decade later. The Empire had extracted 7 years of his body's labor, exposed him to diseases that killed a meaningful share of the men who stood beside him, and returned him, in the end, to almost exactly the same economic position he had occupied the night he took the coin, a working man in Lambeth with no capital, no property, and no institutional safety net beyond what his own 2 hands could earn him. The only genuine difference the transaction had produced, when the accounting was finally done, was that Walter's body now carried the specific, permanent marks of where his labor had actually been spent, and his mother's household had survived 7 years without him, at a cost that no recruiting sergeant standing outside a warm pub had ever once mentioned by name. Walter's own evening, this account has argued, from its opening image onward, was shaped almost entirely by forces considerably larger than himself. Forces that had nothing to do with his own character and everything to do with an empire's appetite for young men's bodies. But he was not the only man standing on that pavement whose choices had been narrowed in exactly this way. Before this story closes, it is worth turning the same patient attention toward the man in the red coat who bought him his supper, because the sergeant's own position inside this machine turns out to be considerably less comfortable than his easy laugh suggested. If you picture the recruiting sergeant as a cynical operator, comfortably profiting from other men's desperation with no cost to himself, you are picturing only the half of him visible from the outside of the pub. Sergeants assigned to recruiting duty in this period were, almost without exception, experienced veterans themselves, men who had already served a decade or more with the colours, frequently exactly the sort of overseas garrisons the recruiting patter described so glowingly. Many carried quietly and permanently the same categories of damage this account has already traced through Walter's own body: a case of chronic dysentery contracted in India that never fully resolved, a recurring fever from a West African posting, joints that ached in damp English winters in ways a younger man's joints did not. Recruiting duty, assigned to senior, reliable, non-commissioned officers as they neared the end of their own service, functioned as one of the few truly desirable postings available to a working-class soldier, a chance to serve out his remaining years on home soil in relative comfort, rather than facing a further overseas rotation, his own aging damaged body might not survive. The bounty system that paid him by the head, rather than through a fixed salary, was not an accident of administrative convenience. It reflected a considered, if rarely stated, calculation on the part of the War Office that a recruiting sergeant paid per successful enlistment would work harder, longer, and with considerably more inventive persuasion than one paid a flat wage, regardless of results. And it transferred the financial risk of a slow recruiting month directly onto the sergeant's own household, rather than onto the army's budget. A sergeant with a wife and children of his own to support, drawing an income that fluctuated with how many young men he could talk, feed, and drink into the ranks each week, faced an economic pressure considerably more immediate and personal than any recruiting poster ever depicted. A pressure that shaped his evenings outside the Mitre and Dove just as thoroughly as Walter's own poverty shaped his walk across Westminster Bridge. This is not offered as an excuse, and it should not be received as one. The sergeant chose every single evening to apply everything he had learned about hunger and loneliness and the specific vulnerability of a man who has not eaten properly in days toward the deliberate end of extracting a signature. He understood the mechanics of the shilling, the impossibility of the smart money for a man in Walter's position, and the mortality odds waiting in India and West Africa considerably better than any of the young men he approached, precisely because he had lived through versions of those odds himself. His hospitality was calculated, his warmth was professional, and the coin he pressed into willing or half-willing hands carried consequences he had spent years watching play out in barracks, hospitals, and regimental burial registers. None of what shaped his own circumstances erases what his choices did to men like Walter. What his circumstances do complicate, in a way worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier villain, is the comfortable modern habit of imagining Victorian military recruitment as a story with one class of predator. The sergeant outside the Mitre and Dove was, in the fullest sense, a product of the identical economic machinery that had produced Walter, a man whose own body had been shaped by poverty, drilled into obedience, exposed to the same diseases, and ultimately handed a livelihood. The exact trap that had once been sprung on him. He had simply moved one rung further up a ladder that never actually led anywhere resembling safety or independence, exchanging the risk of dying overseas for the considerably safer, but morally heavier, work of persuading younger men to take that risk in his place. There is something clarifying and something quietly sad in recognizing this shape for what it actually is. The Empire's recruiting machine did not require villains in any simple sense to keep functioning. It required only a chain of men, each one economically cornered enough to accept the specific role assigned to him: the surgeon who needed his shilling per recruit, the sergeant who needed his bounty per enlistment, and the young man on the pavement who needed a wage badly enough to stop asking too many questions about where it was actually coming from. Every link in that chain could describe, with complete honesty, having had very little real choice in the matter, and every link taken together produced an outcome that ruined lives with a thoroughness no single villain could have managed alone. The sergeant went home that night, as he did most nights, to his own small rooms and his own family, satisfied with a good evening's work, aware in some quiet corner of himself of exactly what that work would eventually cost a cheerful, hungry young man he had just walked to the receiving house, and entirely unable, given his own position in the machine, to imagine any way of earning his living that did not require doing it again the following evening. Step back now from the pavement outside the Mitre and Dove, from the receiving house, and the medical exam, and the troopship deck, and a handful of larger patterns emerge, patterns that the individual chapters of Walter's story could only gesture toward one at a time. The first pattern is this: the performance of glory that Victorian military culture built around the recruiting sergeant, the polished boots, the medals, the tails of elephants and pyramids, required an entire hidden architecture of coercion to keep functioning, and that architecture worked precisely because it never had to announce itself as coercion at all. Nobody frog-marched Walter into a barracks at bayonet point. He walked in willingly, on his own two legs, having accepted a drink and a coin from a man who never once raised his voice or made an explicit threat. And yet, the outcome, a legally binding 7-year commitment of his body to imperial service, extracted from a hungry, exhausted young man over the course of a single evening's hospitality, achieved everything actual coercion might have achieved, while allowing everyone involved, the sergeant, the War Office, the newspapers that printed recruiting notices without comment, to describe the entire system as voluntary. The word volunteer did an enormous amount of quiet work in Victorian recruiting language, covering over a mechanism that had been deliberately engineered to produce a specific outcome from men in a specific condition of desperation. The second pattern sits directly beneath the first, so to speak, and concerns what the Empire was actually mining when it sent its recruiting sergeants out into London's poorer pubs. Poverty itself, in this system, functioned less like an unfortunate social condition the army happened to encounter, and more like a raw material it had learned to harvest with real efficiency. An empire that needed a permanent, renewable supply of soldiers for garrisons, an ocean away, could not depend on patriotic sentiment alone to fill its ranks, not at the wages and under the conditions it was prepared to offer. It needed, instead, a reliable population of men with no better options, and late Victorian London, with its casual dock labour, its cyclical unemployment, and its utter absence of anything resembling a social safety net, supplied that population in essentially inexhaustible quantities. The recruiting sergeant did not create Walter's desperation. He simply positioned himself, night after night, at the exact spot where that desperation was guaranteed to pass by, and waited for the economy to do the difficult work of preparation before he ever had to say a single persuasive word. The third pattern concerns the law itself, and it is perhaps the most quietly damning of the three, because it exposes how a genuinely neutral-looking piece of legislation could produce a thoroughly unequal outcome without technically favoring anyone by name. The 24-hour reconsideration window and the smart money requirement applied, on paper, with perfect equality to every recruit, regardless of his background. In practice, that equality was almost entirely theoretical, because the capacity to actually use the protection the law offered depended on financial resources distributed about as unevenly as anything in Victorian Britain. A safeguard available in principle to everyone, and available in practice almost exclusively to the comfortable classes least likely to need it, is not really protecting the vulnerable at all. It is providing them the appearance of protection, a legal fig leaf that let Parliament describe the enlistment process as fair, while leaving its actual unfairness completely intact for men in Walter's position. The fourth pattern is the one this account has tried hardest to sit with, honestly, rather than resolve into a simpler story, and it concerns the chain of men implicated in Walter's particular evening, each one bound by an economic logic he had very little power to refuse. The sergeant, himself a veteran shaped by the same diseases and the same poverty that would soon shape Walter, needed his bounty per recruit to support his own household. The army surgeon needed his shilling per approval, an incentive that quietly transformed a supposedly rigorous medical examination into something closer to a formality. The War Office needed bodies for garrisons it could not otherwise fill, and built an entire system of payments and incentives, level by level, that ensured each individual actor along the chain could describe his own specific role as simply doing his job, following an established practice. Nobody in that chain needed to be a monster for the system to function exactly as it did. It required only ordinary men, each cornered by his own version of economic necessity, each one rung removed from the next, performing a task that added up collectively to a machine for converting the poorest bodies in London into imperial soldiers with remarkably little friction. The fifth pattern, and the one that connects most directly to the deaths this account has spent time describing, concerns what actually killed the men this system produced once they had been shipped overseas. The recruiting posters sold adventure and, where they acknowledged danger at all, sold it in the shape of combat, a bayonet charge, a heroic last stand, the sort of death that at least came with a story attached. The actual instrument of death waiting for men like Walter in India, in West Africa, on the Sudanese frontier, was overwhelmingly disease, an enemy no recruiting sergeant ever described in his stories because no recruiting sergeant had ever been asked to. Cholera and dysentery killed far more British soldiers across the 19th century than any Mahdist rifle or Asante spear, a fact the War Office understood perfectly well from its own mortality returns and chose, with remarkable consistency, Never to mention to the young men it was still recruiting every single evening outside pubs, exactly like the mitre and dove. None of these patterns require a villain twirling a mustache to explain them, and none of them are offered here to suggest that every man in this story was equally blameless, because they were not. The sergeant made choices, night after night, that he understood the consequences of considerably better than the men he was persuading. What the patterns do offer, taken together, is a picture of how an entire imperial project could run for decades on the backs of men like Walter without requiring any single dramatic act of cruelty to keep it moving. It required only poverty, patience, a shilling coin, a friendly face, and a legal system content to call the whole arrangement voluntary. Walter's particular evening at the Mitre and Dove was not an aberration in that system. It was the system working exactly as designed, one hungry young man at a time, for as long as London kept producing hungry young men and the Empire kept needing bodies to hold what it had already taken. And yet, it would be its own kind of dishonesty to let the story end there, in the cold light of pure mechanism, because the men caught inside this system were never only the sum of the economic forces acting on them. Walter sang on Sunday evenings for pennies before any of this began, and he sang again a little rougher at the edges in the years after he came home. His mother kept 2 children fed and housed through a decade of loss that would have broken plenty of households completely, using nothing but her own hands and a stubbornness the historical record rarely bothers to name. Even the sergeant, trapped in his own corner of the same machine, went home most nights to a family he was trying, in his own compromised way, to provide for. The system this account has described was real, and it was cruel in ways that deserved to be named plainly rather than softened. It was not, however, powerful enough to erase the specific, stubborn humanity of the people caught inside it, and any honest account of Victorian recruiting has to hold both of those truths at once, the machine and the men who kept being more than the machine expected of them. Picture, once more, the corner of King Street and Bridge Street on that November evening in 1888. The gas lamps have just been lit. The fog carries its familiar taste of coal smoke and river water. Outside the Mitre and Dove, a row of soldiers in red coats stand at their ease against the wall, boots polished, medals catching the lamplight, and one of them is laughing warmly at something one of the others has said. A thin young man in a threadbare coat is turning the corner from the direction of the river, hatless, cold, hungry, walking with the particular gait of someone who has not eaten properly in longer than he would like to admit. Nothing about this image has changed since the opening moments of this account. What has changed is everything you now understand about what it actually means. You know now that the sergeant's warmth is not spontaneous, but professional, refined by hundreds of repetitions into something that reads as generosity, precisely because reading as generosity is what earns him his bounty. You know that the coin he is already thinking about pressing into a willing hand, small enough to sit unnoticed in the bottom of a tankard, carries a legal weight entirely out of proportion to its size, a weight the young man walking toward him has no way of measuring in advance. You know about the 24 hours that the law will offer him afterward, a genuine, documented right that will prove entirely useless to a man who cannot produce 21 shillings on a single day's notice. You know about the surgeon down the road, paid a shilling for every recruit he waves through, and about the 7 years with the colours that follow a successful attestation. 7 years that will be spent for a great many recruits in places where cholera and dysentery, not bayonets, do the actual work of killing. You know about the mother in Lambeth who has not yet learned that her household's income is about to change forever. and about the young woman and boy who will grow up during their brother's absence into people he will have to meet again, in a sense, as strangers when he finally comes home. Scale this scene up across the whole of Britain, because Westminster's corner outside the Mitre and Dove was never the only one of its kind. Similar pavements existed outside similar pubs in Manchester, in Birmingham, in the garrison towns and port cities scattered across the country, each staffed by its own recruiting sergeants working the same unhurried practice routine on the same category of hungry. The regiments differed, the accents differed, the specific pub names differed from city to city, but the underlying arrangement, hospitality offered as bait, a coin offered as a trap, a legal window offered as a courtesy nobody poor could actually use, repeated itself with remarkable consistency wherever the army needed recruits and wherever poverty supplied them. Walter's evening was not an unusual case study plucked from the historical record for its dramatic value. It was the ordinary, unremarkable shape that thousands of British evenings took across these years, differing from one another mainly in the small, specific details: the name of the pub, the regiment on the sergeant's collar, the particular illness that would eventually claim or spare a given man once his ship reached its garrison. The young man is 19 years old. His name, for the purposes of this account, has been Walter Coombs, though the actual historical record contains thousands of men who live some close variation of his exact evening, documented in regimental returns and attestation papers, and the grim statistical tables kept by army surgeons counting fever deaths in barracks, hospitals, an ocean away from London. He is thin, undernourished in the specific chronic way that months of irregular meals produce, carrying a dull, unexamined ache in one wrist from years spent working an awl he can no longer afford the tools to use. He does not know, as he crosses that particular stretch of pavement, that he is about to become one of the countless bodies this specific corner of Westminster converted, evening after evening, for more than a decade, into soldiers for an empire that needed his labor considerably more than it needed his consent. And he looks, in that lamplit moment, before anything has happened yet, entirely ordinary. Not tragic, not heroic, not the doomed figure of a cautionary tale. Simply a hungry young man walking toward the promise of a warm meal on a cold November evening. The way hungry young men have always walked toward warmth wherever they could find it. That ordinariness is, in the end, the truest thing this account has to offer about him. He was not a fool for what happened to him. He was not weak or careless or lacking in the judgment a wiser man might have exercised in his place. He was poor in a city and a century that had built an entire, quietly efficient apparatus, specifically calibrated to convert exactly that kind of poverty into exactly the outcome that was about to befall him. An apparatus so well disguised as hospitality, taking the whole scene apart piece by piece to see the machinery running underneath. He is resilient in ways the recruiting sergeants who processed him never had reason to notice or record. He survived 7 years of overseas service that killed a meaningful share of the men who stood beside him at his own attestation. He sends home what pennies he can manage, keeps a mother and 2 younger siblings fed through a decade he is not present for, and comes back, eventually, to a Lambeth that has moved on without him in all the ordinary ways a decade moves a place forward. Older faces, grown children, a singing voice with a little more roughness in it than it used to carry. He is quietly exhausted, the way a body carries the accumulated cost of 7 years it never fully recovers from, dysentery and fever, leaving their permanent small signatures on him long after the uniform comes off for the final time. And he is, in the middle of all of that, still entirely himself, still the young man who once sang for pennies on a Sunday evening, still capable even now, of standing a little straighter when someone asks him, years later, what service in Her Majesty's army was actually like, and choosing, more often than not, to tell them considerably less than the whole of it. He's not, in any of this, a symbol standing in for a larger point about empire or economics. However useful he has been to this account as a way of making those larger points concrete, he is a specific, once-living arrangement of habits and preferences and small private hopes. Man who liked his tea strong, who never quite lost his temper with his younger brother no matter how many questions Sam asked him about the army, who kept, for the rest of his life, a faint or involuntary flinch at the smell of unfamiliar spirits that his own family learned not to remark on. History rarely preserves details this small about men like Walter, which is precisely why they matter, because they are the part of him that the recruiting sergeant, the surgeon, and the War Office never had any reason to record, the part that belonged to him and to nobody else before and after the 7 years the Empire borrowed from him were done. The corner outside the Mitre and Dove did not stay a recruiting ground forever. The pub itself would eventually close, as so many Victorian public houses eventually did, swallowed by the slow redevelopment of Westminster over the following decades. Its exact location today marked by nothing more than an ordinary street corner that gives no visible sign of what once happened there most evenings. What survives instead is the photograph, the one John Thomson took in 1877 for Street Life in London, now held in museum and gallery collections, including the National Portrait Gallery and the National Galleries of Scotland. A single frozen frame of 6 recruiting sergeants standing exactly where you first picture them, patient, dressed for effect, for the next hungry young man to turn the corner. It is a strange kind of permanence that a business built on convincing men to forget themselves for an evening should be preserved for history in the form of a photograph, one of the very first attempts anyone made to document London streets exactly as they were. Thomson and his collaborator, Adolph Smith, were not trying to expose a scandal when they took it. They were simply recording a corner of the city that everyone already knew about and almost nobody had thought to look at closely. If you ever find yourself standing on that same corner of Westminster today, waiting for a bus or simply passing through on the way to somewhere else, there will be nothing left to tell you what once happened there most evenings for the better part of a decade. No plaque marks the spot. No guidebook mentions the Mitre and Dove among the sights worth pausing for. The city has moved on so completely that the whole arrangement, the sergeants, the shillings, the receiving houses, the mortality tables kept quietly in War Office ledgers, has receded into the kind of history that survives only in archives, photographs, and accounts like this one, patched together from regimental returns and attestation papers, and the careful work of historians willing to sit with the ledgers long enough to hear what they were actually recording. That is, in its own way, the final and perhaps most ordinary thing this account has to tell you. Most history disappears exactly like this, not in a single dramatic erasure, but slow, patient indifference of a city that simply keeps living on top of what came before, until only the people who go looking on purpose ever find it again. That, in the end, might be the plainest way to describe everything this account has spent its time doing. Nothing about the Mitre and Dove, the shilling, the smart money, the surgeon's fee, or the mortality tables from India and West Africa was ever truly secret. Parliament debated the smart money requirement openly, in language recorded in Hansard, for anyone who cared to read it. The War Office kept its own mortality returns with careful, grim, statistical precision, fully aware of what disease was doing to the men it had recruited. Newspapers across London printed recruiting notices in the same pages that occasionally, briefly, mentioned the latest cholera outbreak in a garrison town most readers could not have located on a map. All of it was visible, in the way an object left in plain sight on a crowded street becomes functionally invisible simply because everyone has agreed, without ever discussing the agreement, not to look at it too closely. Walter's evening at the Mitre and Dove was not hidden from Victorian society. It was simply the sort of thing polite society had trained itself not to examine, the way you might walk past the same beggar on the same corner every morning without ever quite letting yourself see him. Multiply Walter by the thousands of young men whose attestation papers still sit in archive boxes across Britain, each one a name, an age, a trade, a signature made in a hand, sometimes steady and sometimes visibly unsteady. And you begin to understand the actual scale of what happened on corners like this one across London and every other British city with a garrison town nearby. Most of those men left. No memoir, no letters home preserved by a descendant, no photograph beyond the anonymous group portrait Thompson happened to capture outside one particular pub on one particular afternoon. They exist today mostly as statistics, a mortality rate here, a desertion percentage there, a pension record showing a modest weekly sum granted or denied. It is easy, working through numbers like that, to lose the specific individual weight of any single evening, any single hungry young man turning a specific corner in a specific fog, which is part of why this account has spent so much of its time inside one invented but carefully grounded version of that evening, because the statistics, true as they are, cannot by themselves convey what it actually felt like to be the person the statistics were eventually collected about. There is something worth carrying with you into whatever comes after this account ends, in the recognition that history of this kind rarely announces itself as history while it is happening. Walter did not think of himself crossing Westminster Bridge that November evening as a case study in Victorian recruiting practice or a data point in a future mortality table. He thought about his mother's rent and his empty stomach and the particular cold of a London fog in November, the same ordinary immediate concerns that occupy anyone simply trying to get through a difficult day. The machinery waiting for him outside the Mitre and Dove operated at a scale he had no reason to perceive from inside his own single evening, a scale visible only in retrospect. Only once enough evenings like his had been gathered together into regimental returns and pension records. Patient work of historians like Edward Spires, piecing the pattern back together more than a century later. The lamps outside that corner are long since gone, replaced by whatever ordinary electric lighting illuminates that stretch of Westminster today, indifferent to the history it stands over. The Mitre and Dove itself no longer serves anyone a pint of anything. But somewhere in an archive, a photograph still shows 6 men in redcoats standing at their ease against a public house wall, waiting for a young man who has already, in every sense that matters, come and gone. He took the coin. He served his 7 years. He came home changed, to a mother who had aged and siblings who had grown, and he lived out the remainder of his life, carrying quietly the specific cost of one cold evening's hospitality. He is not the tragic figure of a cautionary tale, and he is not a triumphant survivor either. He is simply a person, ordinary and specific, who walked toward warmth on a difficult night, the way almost anyone would, and found that the warmth had a price attached to it that no one standing beside the fire had thought to mention. It is worth pausing, too, on what became of the system itself, because Walter's particular evening did not mark the end of a practice that simply continued unchanged into the 20th century. The worst of the recruiting pub's excesses, the deliberate targeting of intoxicated men, the coin dropped where a man's own judgment could not reach it, drew increasing criticism through the final years of the 19th century, from social reformers, from a handful of uneasy officers within the army itself, and eventually from a war office that had begun to recognize, slowly and for reasons more practical than humane, that recruits secured through deception and drink made unreliable soldiers prone to desertion and resentment in exactly the numbers this account has already described. By the time the Boer War exposed, in the early years of the following century, just how poorly fed and poorly grown a great many working-class recruits actually were, forcing an uncomfortable public reckoning. The crude theatre of the recruiting pub had already begun giving way to more formal recruiting offices, fixed hours, printed literature, and a slightly more honest, if still far from equal, relationship between the army and the men it needed. None of this came in time to help Walter, or the thousands of men who took the shilling in pubs like the Mitre and Dove during the exact years this account has described. Reform of this kind rarely arrives in time to help the people whose suffering eventually makes the case for it. Ada, for her part, married a clerk some years after Walter's return and raised children of her own in a Lambeth that had grown a little less desperate than the one she remembered from her own girlhood, though she never fully lost the particular vigilance about household money that 11 years of counting pennies against the coming winter had taught her. Sam followed his brother's old trade into leatherwork rather than the docks, a small, private turn away from a river that had taken his father and nearly taken his brother's best years along with him. Their mother lived long enough to see grandchildren born into rooms a little warmer and a little more secure than the ones she had raised her own 3 children in. And she never spoke of the year Walter left if the family's own quiet, half-remembered recollections are to be trusted, without a certain careful flatness in her voice. The tone of someone who had decided long ago that dwelling on it served no one still living. The fog has settled now over that corner of Westminster, the way it settles most evenings, indifferent to whatever it happens to be covering. Somewhere south of the river, in a Lambeth that has long since rebuilt itself into something Walter would barely recognize. The rooms his family once rented have been replaced, renovated, forgotten by everyone except the archive records that still, if you know exactly where to look, hold his name. The story does not resolve into a lesson so much as it settles quietly into the simple fact of having happened to him and to thousands like him, on corners like this one, on countless cold evenings that history mostly declined to notice while they were still warm. That is where this account leaves him. Now walking toward a doorway, toward a fire, toward a stranger's outstretched hand, in the last few seconds, before any of it becomes irreversible. The lamps are low. The fog is thick. Somewhere behind him, the river goes on quietly toward the sea, exactly as it always has, exactly as it will keep doing long after every one of tonight's soldiers, sergeants, and hungry young men has been folded gently and completely into the past.